I was wondering if you could talk about the Quranic or Hadith position on homosexuality and what kind of, if there's any leeway there.
Yeah, I have, in fact, this is a sensitive, I think we have to deal with it head on. Many of the Muslims were very scared to grapple with this issue. In a national convention, I am one of the scholars who said that we have to deal with this issue. Islam opposes homosexuality, lesbianism is opposed Quranically. And of course, he can elaborate on that. My argument with regard to this issue, which is a very sensitive issue, we already have Islamophobia already facing Muslims. And Muslims, if they come out very strongly against the gay groups, they will not only have people who are directly opposed to them. You have the Zionist elements who are very opposed to the Muslims because of political reasons. You have some Christian radicals who are very much opposed to the Muslims for a very region of theology, etc. Then you have the feminist groups who are opposed to the Muslims. Now, if the Muslims come out very clearly against the gay groups, they will have another group against them. You see, so which will make their situation very difficult. At the National Convention of the ICNA, which is the more conservative group among the Muslims, the leadership, they came to me and said, Sulayman, you may have to address this issue for us. Because they're afraid of their own communities. That the Pakistanis and South Asians, they don't want to deal with the issue. It's an issue facing them. They have to deal with this issue. It's an issue we have to deal with. Now, if you're a Muslim, you have to be very strong and come out and say, we share in the Jewish group and the Christian groups this hostility historically against these groups. But what has happened to the West is that the gay groups, just like the African Americans and all the minorities, have been able to use the Second Amendment, the First Amendment rights. That's how you desegregate America. Then what has happened is, that's why you have big debate among the Black American community, who say that these people are using the First Amendment rights and the rights for to be accepted as human beings, as Black Americans, as white Americans. But see, they were always beneficiaries of racism anyway before. But now they are coming to ask for acceptance on a different basis. You see, which is a very sensitive issue which most people don't want to deal with. Because you see, if you're a white homosexual, you have no problem. The Black Americans, they may have double problem. If they were blacks, the Black Christians were not going to accept them as homosexuals. And the whites will not accept them as black anyway, so they have a double whammy problem. That was their problem. If you're a white American, if you're a lesbian, you have no problem, you're white. You can go any place Black Americans couldn't go. But now what is happening in American society is that they are now saying, if you accept these Black Americans, you have these Latinos and all minorities, we should be accepted on our own basis of sexuality. That's where the American issue is. So what has happened in American society is that lesbianism and homosexualism, which were rejected by American society until the modern period in the development, which many people don't want to deal with issue. Both the people from the lesbian group and they don't want to deal with the issue this way. Because see, they forget that they benefited from white racism before. But now that the game is over and we are all now dealing with one another as human beings, they are saying we should be treated on a different basis. The argument you get from many Muslims is that, listen, the problem with these people is not theological. The problem is biological. With the exception of new science and technology, when now you can have a woman who may be barren and you can test two babies. These are the new developments that create these arguments on behalf of these groups. There is no black pill that you can wear and you become white. I made me a very problem with Black Americans. I said, if America, for some reason, had the technology that if you take the pill, you become white, most Black Americans will disappear. They will disappear. But you see, what is happening with the gay movement is that now you have theological, instead of a theological or scientific pill, you have a constitutional pill. That if you now pass the bill now, you solve the problem for the gay groups. That's what is happening now in America. That's why you have all these conventions around the country. It's a very dangerous issue. Many people don't want to deal with it, especially politicians. But this has to be dealt with head on. So when I addressed the Muslim, I told them, what I'm just telling you now, if you go to the internet, I gave a national convention. I said, this is issue. One has to, if you're a Muslim, you can accept homosexuality. You cannot. You show me any Quranic basis for it. There's none. There's no Quranic basis for it. None. And if you look at the fact that they cannot reproduce, if you have a man is in love with another man, they cannot have a kid. They're not going to have children. If a woman and a woman, they may have fun, they may enjoy themselves materialistically, like anybody else. But they are not going to have babies, period. That's just the reality. Now, you can have the irony that you cannot have babies, but you will take some other kid and adopt that kid as their parent. That's just the reality.
Yeah, I should say something about this too. And in general, I agree with what Dr. Sulayman said, that there has to be something that has to be dealt with eventually. But on the whole, most of the Muslims in the traditional Muslim societies are not prepared to deal with that in a public way. And it goes against the original ethos of Muslim societies, which they have, which is that you don't discuss such matters in public. And you don't generally discuss your business in public. And people keep the house, the secret of the house, secret. So we were not supposed to be, like, what are those, the reality shows or TV shows where the, like Family Feud or something like that, are the very antithesis of Muslim ethics and, classical ethics. Because you don't let it all hang out. You conceal everything. And not just gayness, but everything. Heterosexual desires, the same thing. You just don't discuss that. And so everyone is very prim and proper. And that actually befits classical types of societies where there's little mobility. Take the village society that Dr. Shafia referred to, for example. In a classical village, where the village was everything, where collective responsibility was most important to the group, to the family group, the clan, and their individual desires were less important, and so on. Every single member of that village had better not mess up, or else their name will be mud forever in their village, and consequently, you don't find people talking in the village about things, and it places a limit on gossip. It doesn't stop it, of course, but it places a limit on it, especially a limit of trust, because who can you trust not to tell your gossip to the wrong people, and thereby create a situation where you make a permanent problem for yourself. So that contrasts rather completely and totally with modern urban culture, with Western emphasis on individualism and so on. And that, to some extent, from there arises the source of the problem. Yet one will have to admit that the Muslim society has changed drastically since classical times. If you look at Edward Lane's book, The Manners and Customs of the Modern Egyptians, you will see that in that day, and in Edward Lane doing his own research in Egypt in the 1820s and 1830s for that book, that everyone whatsoever had to be married. And because he went there and wasn't married, nobody would allow him to stay. He wasn't allowed to stay anywhere. I mean, he could stay briefly in a hotel, but he had to, he could not stay and do research. And so he betook himself back to England, married, brought his wife back with him to Egypt, and that is how he conducted his research. Now, 175 years later, it's not true. Not in Egypt anymore. Not everybody is married anymore. This is a tremendous upheaval, because even though the percent of Egyptians who never get married is still very small, there are some, see. In the old days, one would wonder then what happened to gay people. Now, another thing, one has to define what gay is before one can deal with it, and to have some kind of theory about it, because, the traditional explanation is, well, it's just wanton. It's just wantonness. In other words, people out of wantonness do that. And it's not because they have some kind of innate disposition, but rather it's because of wantonness. And if wantonness is something people are responsible for themselves, so they have to be controlled and repressed on that point. But if it is some innate disposition, then that's another matter. Another question that arises is, as far as the etiology or explanation of the source of it is what are the relative proportions of it in this or that place? I could say, having studied, a general stereotype of this, that generally the population of any given country will imagine that gayness is rampant in other populations, especially those that they feel some reticence about or animosity towards, and that is a classical stereotype also. So consequently, for example, when Western tourists go to Muslim countries and see Muslim men holding hands and so on, they say, oh, this is a gay paradise, all the men are gay. But what do the Muslim men think about that? They think all the Westerners are gay. They have exactly the reverse image precisely. It's exactly tit for tat, in fact. It's not intended to be that, but that's what it is, in effect. So they have a kind of a parity of view in that. And I don't know what the cause of it is exactly. Nobody knows, but I would say that it would be a default position that one would have to take as the default position and would have to work to prove against it, that all populations whatsoever have exactly an equal proportion of people who have homosexual orientation. And that proportion, based on what I have read, should be approximately 4% of any given population. And on the basis that a population is 50% male and 50% female, that would mean that the given population would be 2% each gay female, gay male. And based on the fact that a population with a lot of young people, such as was true until recently when the great birth dearth started in all countries, and it's only a few African countries now are not characterized by the drop in birth rates, where you would say that the whole population is under 15, the half of the population is under 15, or the median age is 15 or 19 or whatever. You could say just, as a not exactly accurate, but rough rule of thumb, that therefore 1% of the males in a country would be gay, but would be yet not adult, and there would be 1% adult gay males, and that would be easy to calculate, because then you could just divide any population by 100, and there you'd have that population. And I would say that this estimate could be off by a factor of 2, perhaps, but probably not more than that, because just based on a person's experience in life and the amount of gay people one encounters and so on, that you would think that the population has to be something like this amount. And it would seem to me that whatever the cause of it is, that it is innate, because the people who are gay will say either that it's innate, that is, that it's genetic, or it's something that is, prenatal, or else it is something that is learned in extremely early childhood when one is not responsible for oneself, like by the time one is 4 or something like that, that it's set. If that is so, then it would seem difficult to maintain the classical attitudes, which were that it's just wantonness. And it would seem that some revision of that would be called for, even though there's a lot of problematic that remains with it. A society that tries to promote marriage between man and woman, and marriage with children, indeed, as a universal ideal for all of its members, going back to its classical past, where the survival of the human race was uncertain, because plagues would come along and wipe out 50% of the population, and it would seem like the whole world was dying and stuff like that. So there was plenty of reason to think in the old days that people should have as many children as possible. And it's not so remote in our own country's history that people did that. I mean, One of my ancestors who died in 1812 had 16 children, evidently from the same wife. And my own grandfather was the youngest of 11 children, and so on. And that's all from the same mother. And that's more than the usual reproduction rate, because the total fertility rate that seems historically to be maximally maintainable in a population is 8 children per woman. So in other words, classically, when there was no birth control and there were pronatal positions taken by all the religions, which certainly was the position, of the Christian religion in general, go forth and multiply, and of the Jewish religion too, and the Muslims as well. You have as many children as possible, and that would be, or work out to classically 8 children per woman. And when I was young, a couple of countries still had that as the total fertility rate. Kenya had over 8 per woman, or just like 8.1 maybe, and that's about it. And Rwanda and Burundi had that. Today, no country has that. The highest are Niger and Mali, and they can barely maintain 7. So the birth rate is even going down in those 2 countries, which are the last holdouts, in effect. A country like Pakistan, the birth rate's already down to 4 children, the total fertility rate down to 4 children per woman. And in Egypt, I think it's below 3 now. Algeria, Tunisia, Turkey, Iran have fallen below the total, replacement rate, which is 2.1 children per woman. And frankly, that means that it would not seem that the people being gay, by failing to reproduce, are failing to uphold some absolute necessity, because now the world is overcrowded and the human population is threatening to crush and destroy everything. And it's true that if we have a birth crash that leads to, the drastic decline of the human race, that might not be good. But on the other hand, it would have a long way to go before the population would get down to such a dangerous position. So anyway, the thing is that if you have a society like China, where they mandated 1 child per woman, or even our society where it's about 2, and and many European countries it's under 2, and so the birth rate is dropping, and that creates a crisis of another type. 2 children per woman do not fulfill the woman's classical duty as homemaker, mother, etc. Classically, when women were pregnant, nursing, bearing children, raising young children, raising their daughters' children, if they should live so long, all the time, there just wasn't time to do anything else, and that was basically it. And for a woman to expect to have 8 children and be able to compete with males in the workplace, when to begin with there wasn't even any workplace anyway, is sort of ridiculous to criticize the past on that basis. But one, on the other hand, has to admit, if it comes down to 2 children per woman, then the woman may be held back somewhat by raising the 2 children in trying to compete with males for equality in work, but on the other hand, she will not be fulfilled by that. And there's nothing so disastrous in the history of the human race psychologically as the absolute desolation of the suburban housewives of the Ozzie and Harriet type. And I could attest to that, because that's the kind of situation I grew up in. I could see, that would happen. I mean, the women by hook or by crook would have to find some kind of activity to do in order to fill their day, because the children didn't take up all the time anymore because they weren't numerous enough. Now, going back to the question of gay, it would seem that if people are not going to have children at the same rate, then it doesn't seem that a condemnation of gay on that basis is open to availability either. And but the thing is that marriage, when it's regulated classically, in Islam, one of the biggest things in the Muslim society in general has been the necessity of knowing who the father is. So the fathers must take responsibility for their children. And this is something that's been constantly reiterated and is even a major attraction of Islam in the African American community. And it's perfectly worthy because it does appear that children are benefited by having both father and mother when they are brought up. In general, that appears to be the case. Now, one may be able to make some other arguments about other special conditions, so I'm not completely excluding that, but basically that seems to be quite a worthy model, and that then becomes the model of the Muslim family. So when you introduce the idea of the public acceptance of gayness, as opposed to the surreptitious acceptance of it on the basis of don't ask, don't tell, you bring out another type of relationship that sort of decenters the classical model of father and mother. And that then becomes the basis of opposition by evangelical Christians and so on, although one also has to admit that there is just basically prejudice also, because people are prejudiced and disgusted by gayness. That arises because heterosexuals have a very difficult time understanding how gayness could exist. It becomes something that they just find a hard time understanding. And if they force themselves to accept it, they may be able to, be okay with it. But the possibility of understanding it becomes very difficult. You wanted to say something?
Well, in the Bible, it mentions two gay men, Iliad. Is there anything in the Quran?
To be a man?
No. Are there any references to homosexual activity in the Quran?
Oh, yes, it's prohibited. The story of Lot is given in the Quran. And on the whole, although it's less detailed than the biblical story, and it is repeated numerous times in the Quran, and on the whole, one would have to say that the verses are a little bit more anti-homosexual than the Bible verses are, in the sense that there's a verse, for example, that says, do you come unto men instead of women sexually? Indeed, you are an excessive folk, or you're behaving prodigally or something like that. And elsewhere it says you leave aside the girl, the women that God has created for you, and so it's a little bit more explicit, although it doesn't quite prevent the possibility of an alternative interpretation. And so just like gay people have reinterpreted the story of Lot to be a prohibition of homosexual rape rather than homosexual relationships, the same interpretation is conceivable in the Quranic verses. The extra-Quranic tradition of the Hadith contains some blood-curdling strictures against gay activity, male gay activity, by the way. I should say that although lesbianism is discountenanced by analogy, there is not a single reference to it in either the Quran or the Hadith. And the traditions that prescribe various forms of torturous execution for practitioners of gay sex in the Hadith are probably all weak traditions, because Ibn Hazm, the medieval Spanish muhaddith, who is a very curious advocate of romantic love himself, although apparently a heterosexual, completely scoffed at all of the anti-homosexual traditions in the Hadith that prescribe punishments, and said there is no punishment for it, and that the prescriptions of punishments are all fabrications and are all weak Hadiths and should not be accepted. So the point of it being against male gay sex, that is there. And then, of course, it also feeds into the problem of masculinity and what does it mean to be a man and so on. And that a man, if they put themselves in the position of a woman, not to mince words, who is penetrated, then that becomes like the worst thing. And so conventionally in a Muslim society, that is viewed as the worst thing. And even though in the law, the performance of gay sex by both parties is equally punishable, is considered equally punishable, and in various ways in the different schools of law, the popular view of it is that the penetrator is not so much to be reproached, but the penetrated is, and is a person who is to be completely dissociated with, loathsome, disgusting, filthy, and blah, 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 on and on. And the insult for that in Arabic, which is, I shouldn't say this, but there's nobody here maybe that would take offense, so I don't know. The word khawal, which is the official word, I mean, the common word for that, which actually means a possession. Like it's actually a classical Arabic word. And as classical Arabic word, it means all of one's possessions. So a person who is like that is somebody who's been possessed, I guess. And that's how the analogy works for that. And that's like the lowest of the low as far as Egyptian society is concerned. And the way that this was reflected recently in Egypt was that the coming out of gayness, which came out really, say, at the end of the 1960s in the United States, took a couple of decades to really reach the consciousness of the Egyptian public. And before that, of course, as I said, if there's an equal proportion of people who are like that in every society at all times and places, then they would be practicing this surreptitiously. And they would be doing that on the side. And in the classical times, usually while married, so they'd be married to women and practicing gay sex on the side, or vice versa if it were women. And they would, and because society generally did not inquire into what people were doing sexually, it would be hidden. And if people were just discovered by chance, it would probably, in many cases, be more convenient to just forget about it instead and just shove it under the rug, so to speak. And so people could get away with that quite a lot then. And then, but when it all came out and became public then, and so people started to think about that, then there started to be more pressure to conform to public heterosexuality, just as there always has been and continues to be to this day in the United States, in spite of gay liberation, in spite of any laws that are enacted, etc. One should hardly assume that prejudice against gays is over here. I think that would be ridiculous to assume. And when that came out, the Egyptian government started to take advantage of this to use as another political football, for one thing, to, in theory, please the right-wing or conservative Muslims, but for another thing, to try to eliminate what they would see as corruption in their own society that they believe in. And so the Egyptian government, after formerly having not done anything about that, engaged in a long series of a policy which probably has just broken down now because of the humiliation of the police and the collapse of the Mubarak regime. But up until that point was continuing, which was a persecution of gay men. And so they were using all kinds of entrapment to entrap gay men, and using informers for them to denounce other gay men and then arrest them and beat them until they admitted and denounced other people and so on. So it was a virtual witch hunt that was going on there. That may have subsided now, and I would imagine that the gay men in Egypt were they're out there eagerly demonstrating against the Mubarak regime, which was pursuing them in this way. Anyway, and I remember that when that subject came up in the 80s, my landlady's family were talking, and her brother said, You see, Ustaz Khalid, we don't have this here in Egypt. There are no gay people in Egypt. There is no such thing. See? So there was just kind of a total denial. And then also, I think that anyone who wants to actively oppose the current Muslim dispensation of things ought to recognize that Rome wasn't built in a day, and if they want to improve matters, that the way to do so maybe not be some kind of confrontationalist approach. That probably will be counterproductive.
So is it safe to assume that in the privacy of people's homes there, is acceptance of family members who
No.
may be gay? No.
Mm-mm.
Not them.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
It would all be done surreptitiously. Although there would sometimes be a knowledge about somebody that they are gay and that they are having some gay relations and so on. But that would be seen as a defect in that person, and that would be talked about surreptitiously as gossip.
So even within the American Muslim community?
Well, the American Muslim community is in America, so it has a different situation. And it's exceedingly diverse, so there isn't any established single principle. Because here we have immigrants who bring the attitudes of the immigrants with them. We have lots of African Americans whose society generally reflects the society, even the Christian African American society's attitudes reflect those of the Muslim world anyway on this issue, being extremely disapproving of it. And so African Americans who become Muslims then don't pick up a favorable attitude toward gays or gay liberation. And then there's another factor that militates against gay liberation, which is that gay liberation is perceived as a phenomenon of white imperialism, and it is. And that's, I think, something you were trying to sort of hint or point at, although I'm not sure that's what you were saying exactly.
You see, when these Muslim leaders came to me, they know that I will do not only a theological understanding, and we all mentioned it. The Christians and the Jews and Muslims were all on the same page on this issue. What is happening is the revisionism that has taken place in the Jewish community and in the Christian community, to the point that even today at the political level in America, you see even in the Republican Party, they have their own gay people in the Republican Party. You see, because of politics. So what is happening with the Muslim community, what he is saying, if you look at it at the different levels, you can look at it theologically. The Muslims, the Christians, you go to the Catholics, for example, you have nunneries, which in Islam, they don't accept nunnery. You see, a woman has to have a husband, has to know sex. Of course, you can have sex with a man, but you have to be legitimate sex, not illicit sex. Yet this has been the tradition. What modernity has done for us is has given rise to all we are talking about right now. Most people don't want to talk about this issue the way we are talking about it right now. You see, even the gay people don't want to deal with this issue publicly because they don't want to be targeted. So, you see, the Muslims who are analyzing this issue sociologically, if you're a sociologist, you can speak the way we are talking. Because you're looking at human society, and you see human society, the goodness and the badness of human beings. That's sociology.
Well, I think there is some possibility of talking about it at the academic level like we're trying to do here. So at least that's, a point of incremental slight increase of openness on that subject. But it's a difficult thing because one also has to think, religion should deal with people compassionately. Now that we see that sexual orientation is either an innate or early learned orientation, and I think that simply has to be accepted. I mean, maybe one could say that there's a conspiracy of Western studies that makes it out to be that way, but it's still wantonness and so on. So one could try to go back and defend the wantonness theory. But with me, that's not convincing. With me, it seems to be clearly an orientation. And the orientation of it would mean that, well, do you want these people marrying, say, gay men marrying women who will then make them unhappy? Is that, supposed to be the solution? Because often that's been the solution that would be said too. Like if somebody would say to somebody, like their friend, well, I have this inclination, they would say, oh, well, we have to rush you to marriage immediately. That will be the solution. You just get married fast and then that will solve everything. Well, now that's not really the way that issue is thought of anymore, see, because people think of, the necessity of romantic affection. And after all, in Islamic law, the man is supposed to really please the woman. I mean, it's not a matter of just, performing a sexual function barely, assuming that a gay male can do that. There's more to marriage than that. The woman expects affection and love, and it says in the Quran, we made affection between you. So, and then to deny that all to the gay people, that it doesn't seem to be, fair. I mean, it seems to me that there's still a big messiness of having to figure out how this conceivably could work out in any way that has a good outcome. I think that there is a big problem here. And obviously, judging by the continuing positions of, I believe, the Mormon Church, of whom a couple of you belong to, the Catholic Church, whom a couple more of you belong to, Orthodox Judaism, at least, which is the co-religionists of another of you, and so on, share with the Muslims this thing. It just may be that the Muslims don't have any wing of people that have accepted this. So we don't have, some place where that is just in a comfort zone, although there are people here in this country who are working on that. And so maybe something will come out in a generation in Islam about that too, very likely. Whether the rest of the Muslim world will accept that or not, that's another issue. I mean, a lot of conservative Christians will not accept Christian groups that accept this at all. So it remains definitely unresolved. And I don't think it's fair to say that it's just that, well, gay liberation is right and that's just all fine and dandy and they should just be able to say, we ought to be able to just get married and everybody accept that and that's fine. I mean, it seems to me that there's yet some messiness left over with, well, what impact is that having on the rest of society? So, I think there still is some possibility of some counter-arguments to the gay marriage position and so forth. But on the other hand, I would have to, on the whole, I admit that it would seem to be that the old classical position that it's mere wantonness is just indefensible.